I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as reports flood in of Russian units being hunted deep within Ukraine, we reveal more details of the operation and assess its significance for the Trump-Putin summit on Friday. Then we hear more from Adelie about her reporting trip to Ukraine and discuss a new report into what Europe can do for its long-term strategic autonomy.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We are strong. We are Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 13th of August, 3 years and 172 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Adelie Pojzman-Pontay, freelance journalist David Kirichenko, and researcher and our translator, Mykola Kuzmin. But first, the key updates from me of the past 24 hours. It makes sense to combine the military and political updates today, as both are impacting the other to a particularly intense degree, as the world awaits significant meetings this afternoon in Berlin and in Alaska on Friday, where Dom, I'm happy to say, is currently flying to. First, the frontline situation, where Ukraine has said its forces are fending off Russian infantry units that pierce their defensive positions in eastern Donetsk. They now acknowledge that a small group of Russian troops bypassed Ukrainian positions near Dobropilya, but rejected reports of a breakthrough. President Zelensky said small groups of Russian soldiers, each of 20 to 30 troops, had advanced about 6 miles behind the front lines. One of those groups had been killed or captured, and the others would be hunted down, he said. Now, this town is around 20 kilometres north of the key strategic city of Pokrovsk. Ukrainian forces are taking effective measures to halt the advance, the General Staff said yesterday, describing the situation as complex and dynamic. Zelensky is claiming Moscow wants to create a narrative that Russia's advancing and Ukraine is losing in preparation for the Alaska summit. So what more do we know about this assault? One thing to emphasise, as Zelensky did, is the relatively small size of these units. I've read reports this morning of lightly equipped troops in camouflage uniforms setting ambushes, with logistic support delivered by small drone deliveries. Some are blaming diversionary reconnaissance groups, i.e. small assault infantry groups of 2, 4 to 6 men, or motorcycle buggy groups which can bypass that porous defensive line if they can get past the drone coverage. They break through, then call in swift support to try and reinforce, the optimum word there being try. As the Institute for the Study of War writes, Russian mill bloggers, who often inflate Russian advances, are questioning Moscow's ability to exploit the tactical penetration. Several mill bloggers, they say, urge caution, noting that forces have yet to consolidate their positions and that the penetration is not a full-scale breakthrough. One claimed Russian forces infiltrated Ukrainian defences in a splayed manner, and that the depth of the penetration threatens Russia's ability to secure its flanks. A Ukrainian source stated Ukrainian forces destroyed several Russian groups that had infiltrated the area and were pushing back Russian forces trying to gain a foothold. I should add that some Ukrainian units are questioning the maps many of you have seen, with territory reported as being in Russian hands still controlled by them, by the Ukrainians. Sources I've spoken to this morning emphasise that this is not a sector of fixed trenches, but of staggered positions with large gaps in between. That means that these small Russian units can sneak through and claim progress while the situation is actually more porous than it appears. Other experts are keen to underscore that in mobile warfare, a breach in the line isn't always a disaster. It can present a chance to strike back, hitting the exposed flanks and cutting off the advance. The effectiveness, though, of that response hinges on whether the Ukrainian armed forces had anticipated this. Likewise, do Russian forces possess the mobility, reserves and coordination needed to exploit any gains. A single penetration is rarely decisive. The danger only comes if multiple breaches occur simultaneously, tipping the balance towards, well, collapse. So in summary, the trajectory remains uncertain, and the coming days will reveal more. It is possible that Ukrainian reserves will plug the gaps and push the Russians back, or, also possible, that Moscow's forces will reinforce and make gains. Either outcome, of course, will impact the tone of conversations in Alaska, which I'll turn to in a moment. One just last thing on this, though, it has reignited familiar discussions about Ukrainian versus Russian strategic adaptability and leadership. The Wall Street Journal has just published a long read titled "Ukraine's Once Nimble Army is Mired in Soviet Decision-Making," which argues that in the first year of the invasion, Ukraine's defenders repeatedly outmaneuvered a lumbering Russian army, relying on improvisation and the judgment of men in the field. 3 years on, Ukraine's military has slipped back into a more rigid, top-down mode of fighting with roots in the Soviet era, creating mounting frustration about unnecessary casualties while hurting civilian morale and army recruitment. Without overhauls, the Soviet-style habits could undermine Ukraine's ability to sustain its defence against Russia, which shows no sign of relenting in its quest to conquer the country. Privately, says the journal, many Ukrainian soldiers repeat a bitter refrain: "Big Soviet army beats little Soviet army." It is, as I was saying, a familiar argument, particularly with regards to Ukraine's earlier adaptability. I'm not completely convinced that this phase of the war, the term Soviet versus non-Soviet, is an entirely helpful one. I think it oversimplifies a little bit. Today, a military can be Soviet in some ways and more Western and adaptive in others. Just look at the Russians, who are now innovating on the battlefield, technologically and tactically. Yes, in some places they use the meat grinder strategy of yore, but in others they saturate the battlefield with FPV drones at the cutting edge. It's not simplistic these days. But as soon as one says Soviet, the mind leaps to only centralised command and frozen tactics predicated on mass. Now, a last word on the military picture before turning to politics. Ukraine's military claims drones hit the Unicha oil pumping station, in Russia's Bryansk region overnight, causing damage and a large-scale fire. There are also reports of drones hitting a storage facility in Russia's Republic of Tatarstan, home to a Shahed-type attack drone and foreign components factory used in their assembly. That's about 1,300 kilometres from Ukraine. The attack follows a similar strike on August the 9th. So, to politics specifically, Zelensky said in his overnight address that Kyiv would reject any Russian proposal to give up the Donbass region in exchange for a ceasefire, warning it could be used by Russia as a springboard for future attacks. This is an important point many have been keen to underscore today. Ukraine cannot give up that territory because of its strategic importance for protecting the rest of the country. I think it's also vital to emphasise just how massive this region is. It would require Zelensky to order troops to withdraw from 9,000 square kilometres of Ukrainian territory, handing Moscow a victory that its army couldn't achieve militarily for more than a decade. This is an extraordinary ask, and the fact that it's even being contemplated is even more remarkable. Now, Zelensky has just arrived in Berlin to join European leaders for a video call with Donald Trump later today. We know no more now than we reported yesterday on the argument being presented to the US president, but I think we can guess. I was quite amused, I have to say, by this post by the historian Dr. Sergei Radchenko, who writes, "One reason why Europe's Russia policy has been so ineffective is that it's mired in a constant tug of war between those who want but can't, those who can but won't, and the rest who can't and won't." I think that sums it up rather neatly. Where we have learned more relates to Friday. Trump will meet Putin one-on-one in Alaska, the White House has confirmed. So they won't be flanked by their advisors when they come face-to-face. We also know the location: Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, a military base in Anchorage. The White House now seems keen to portray this as a listening exercise for Trump. The goal of this meeting is for the president to walk away with a better understanding of how we can end the war, his press secretary told reporters. Look, only one party that's involved is going to be present, and so this is for the president to go and get, again, a more firm and better understanding of how we can hopefully bring this war to an end. She also said the president was honoured and looking forward to hosting Putin on American soil. Only a handful of hours later, during a phone call with Kim Jong-un, Putin praised the bravery, heroism and self-sacrificing spirit of North Korean troops, one of the most hostile states in the world towards the United States, in how it has fought on European soil in Ukraine. These are strange times indeed. But let's turn to Adelie now. Delighted to have her back with us here in London and in the studio next to me. Adelie, you've just returned, as I say, from Ukraine. We've already heard many things from you, which have been great over the last few days, but where do you want to pick up? What have been some of your observations over the course of your week?
Hi, Francis. It's good to be back in the studio with you. I was in Ukraine for about 10 days to work on a slightly different project that you'll hear in this podcast in due course, so bear with me. I can't tell you very much about my reporting just now, but I wanted to give you a sense of the atmosphere and the mood music in Kyiv and in the different places I've been in Ukraine. My general sense throughout the week was of people's just plain exhaustion. The last 3 months of increased air raids and strikes have truly worn people out. My week was actually incredibly calm and quiet. There were very few sirens, never for a serious attack. And Kyiv looked almost like a normal European city in the summer. The terraces were filled with people, the crackling of conversation and of the ice cubes melting in cocktail glasses. But all week there were rumours of an upcoming massive drone attack. It seemed that everyone was holding their breath while the bigwigs of diplomacy that you so well report on every day, Francis, figure out their plans for this week and the Alaska summit. And maybe the Russians were looking at Pokrovsk rather than Kyiv. The attack, therefore, never materialised, but for those I spoke with, the short respite was met with wariness. People told me, if it's not for tonight, it will be tomorrow, or the day after, or the next week. One friend had several strikes in her neighbourhood in the last few months, 2 of which destroyed her friend's home, houses that she'd visited regularly ever since she was a child. She told me over borscht one night, I feel like it's getting closer and that it's closing in on me. The upcoming talks in Alaska seemed to be met by everyone I spoke to with scepticism and a lot of pessimism as well. And although the recent protests against Zelensky have died down, the gap between civil society and those who lead them is ever widening. It says a lot that no one in Zelensky's office anticipated how unpopular their corruption bill would be and what it could spark. It was a sign of short-sightedness, but it was also incredibly out of touch with what moves civil society in Ukraine. And there's an overhanging question, I think. These talks that are happening far away from Ukraine without any Ukraine representative at the table, how out of touch is that? And also disrespectful with a society that's been fighting for its very survival for the last 3 years. Now, Zelensky's popularity obviously took a plunge with the corruption bill. We've talked a lot about this. But he's fascinatingly managed to stay away from another trend that has put society's teeth on edge. That's the violent incidents between civilians and the military mobilization agency. Our friend Fabrice Depré at the Financial Times wrote about it last week, and so he was filling me in. Several videos have circulated showing Ukrainian men being picked off the street and brutally crammed into vans. In Mykolaiv, an investigation has even been opened into the death of a man who reportedly jumped from a bridge in an attempt to flee from draft officers. And in Vinnytsia, where I was on Saturday, roughly 80 people came to a standoff with the local police near a stadium, asking for the release of recently mobilized men who had been brought there. But there's also an interesting dichotomy here. In a recent poll, 77% of respondents expressed distrusts in the draft officers, while at the same time, 93% trusted the military as a whole. I'll link to Fabrice's story in the show notes, obviously. But this points to Ukraine's general distrust of the state and institutions on the one hand, and that includes the justice system, for example. That's something I've heard a lot about in interviews when I ask people who have witnessed or survived war crimes or sexual violence. I ask them, do you trust the prosecutor's office? Do you trust judicial bodies to bring you justice and closure, most people just say no. Most people just say no. It's been really surprising to me. But on the other hand, Fabrice also explained to me that Zelensky had quite remarkably managed to always point to the army on any of the mobilization conversation. He's dodged the mounting frustration throughout the country on this score for the last 3 years. And I think that's a quite remarkable political move, to be able to extract yourself as the president of a country at war in martial law of the mobilization issue. I mean, in terms of political communication, it is just really remarkable. Finally, there's a third story that I wanted to touch upon, because it's a topic closely related to what I was working on during my trip, and that is the issue of children. Last week, there were several headlines talking about a catalogue of Ukrainian children being sold by some organizations, and I hope you hear the quotation marks in my voice there. I know, Francis, you've briefly talked about it in the podcast, not in those terms, but I've spoken to a few people close to this issue, and I think it's really important to be precise here. So, this is not a catalogue, it is an adoption database that pertains to the Luhansk People's Republic. It's publicly available on the website of the local Ministry of Education, and therefore it's neither secret, nor hidden, nor leaked to the press. It follows the same format that all Russian adoption databases have and have had for decades now. They all include photographs, they all include physical description of the children, and they all include the ability to filter through physical descriptors such as eye color. Now, that's something that is shocking in and of itself, and I get that point, of course, but it is crucially not new, which is what is important for this story. These databases, as I said, have existed for a very long time, not just in the temporarily occupied territories, and not just for Ukrainian children. What has happened, to my understanding, is that the Luhansk database has now been linked with the other Russian databases. It's also not a marketplace. No one is selling the children. The follow-up question to this is, could this data, publicly available on the internet about minors, get into the wrong hands and be used for further child trafficking? The answer is maybe. Although I've yet to come across data or research that shows that Ukrainian children on these databases, these adoption databases in Russia, are more vulnerable to child trafficking than any other child. I'll continue digging, however. A source has told me this, that a kid being present in these databases, whether they are Ukrainian or Russian, means that they are in an orphanage. Now, the story of Ukrainian children being put up for adoption by Russia, being presented as Russian citizens, their identities being changed in order to make them appear to be Russian, is a very legitimate story. But it's, as ever, important to approach it sensibly and with a cool head and with all the facts. One of my sources in the investigative community has also told me that these databases, which are publicly available, are also a way for them to track the children and to identify where these Ukrainian children that they are looking for, that have been reported missing, are. Are they put up for adoption? Where are they in Russia? Where are they located? What's happening to them? And so shedding light and drawing attention to these databases is also, in a way, hindering investigators' efforts. One of my sources told me they were worried that a source like that, which is really precious, could potentially disappear. And so they had to mobilize all of their resources to make sure they were across everything that was in there, in case all of this social media storm and outrage were preventing them from continuing their work and their investigations. He said they thought it was a pity that the media shed statements without digging deeper into what exactly these databases were. And also that they really regretted that the efforts to identify and return the kids were still not coordinated. So I think what's interesting here is that at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, these databases have been slowly but surely synchronized with Donetsk and Luhansk. For a while, they were switched off, and now they're back online. So what's interesting is that these databases at the beginning of the full-scale invasion were synchronized between Donetsk, Luhansk, and the rest of the Russian Federation. And then they were switched off, which means that if you search for the adoption database for Luhansk or Donetsk in the federal databases, nothing would come up. Unlike Crimea, which is considered a proper, quote-unquote, Russian region, Russian jurisdiction. My sources weren't sure what was the reason behind that, but that means that they didn't have full legislative control of these territories. They were still treated as new territories by the rest of the Russian Federation. But I think it does say something about the mechanical process of how Russia is slowly but surely absorbing these databases, these institutions, the ministries and all these systems of the occupied territories into the greater Russian system. And obviously, my sources were telling me that these kids are Ukrainian children on Ukrainian soil. They should not be put up for adoption. And there shouldn't be a problem there, as in they shouldn't be put up for adoption. And these are not a list of children that you should bring to Putin saying bring them back, because legally they are Ukrainian children on Ukrainian soil. But the mechanics of how they're being taken and how they're being absorbed in the greater Russian institution machine here, I think is really interesting. And so these were my reflections from the trip, Francis.
Well, thanks, Adelie. We look forward to sharing with you all more from her trip in the coming weeks. Let's turn now to our guests. We've got two subjects to discuss. The first, one of the key topics of the moment, especially given the dramatic events of the past few days, European military capability, independent of the US. The second, how we translate this podcast into Ukrainian and Russian. If you're wondering why we're covering both these topics at the same time, the answer is the man right next to me, because Mykola Kuzmin, further to having co-written a report with David Kirichenko on European defence, is also our translator every day. But let's do the report first. David, welcome. You're dialing in on the line from Ukraine. Great to have you both here. So this report for the Henry Jackson Society, this is, of course, a foreign policy think tank here in London. It's called European Defence Autonomy, Identifying Key Companies and Projects to Replace US Capabilities. It's a rich report and impossible to do justice, but in a quick-fire sense, just take us through the different areas it covers one by one. Let's start with long-range strike capabilities, Mykola.
Good afternoon, Francis and Adelie. It's my pleasure being here. I've been listening, obviously, to the Telegraph for a long time. And actually, I would like to start a bit from backstory so we understand where we are and why we are right now here. So, since the end of the Cold War, most European states underinvested in handpower, sourcing key enablers to the United States. The result is, of course, a structural dependence on Washington for intelligence, surveillance, integrated air and missile defense, and long-range precision strike, strategic air fleet, and air-to-air refueling. And this fragmented procurement and ITAR-bound supply chains compounded the problem. Even after Russia's first invasion in 2014, reforms moved too slowly, and they still do. If we look at NATO Europe today, after 3 years of war, we have a fragmented but growing long-range strike capability. The recent purchase by Poland of huge 500 HIMARS order dominates the numbers, with smaller stocks in countries like Romania and Baltics, but overall European-based HIMARS or equivalent launchers are still counted in the low hundreds, nowhere near the scale Russia could bring to bear. That is why the systems like the German-Israeli Europulse matters. It's in production in Germany, it avoids the US export controls, can fire munitions from 35 kilometers to 300 kilometers Predator Hawks, and can be mounted on multiple platforms for rapid mobility. Yet it's still not in mass service, and the Bundeswehr order in the starting point, but is designing to scale, giving Europe a sovereign HIMARS class option. Now, the war also has shown us that the building rockets fast can be like a David versus Goliath fight, except here David wins only if he has a factory behind the sling. We know that Russia tried to sabotage lots of productions, and in contrast, Russia will try to use cheap, improvised systems without hesitation, even if they have high failure rates or come to a human cost, launching from the back of a civilian lorry, a frozen riverbank, or a camouflaged shed in a village. As the Russian saying goes, даже палка раз в год стреляет, even a stick can shoot once a year, and Moscow is willing to fire a lot of sticks if it means getting through. In the crisis, a European deep strike magazine must therefore to be predispersed, road mobile, and constantly replenished, not stored in one vulnerable depot. Crucially, those strikes will not stand alone. In Ukraine, deep fires occurred by drones, covered by satellites, and timed around electronic warfare windows. And obviously that will be covered more in detail. But I also would like to show, and obviously we talked about this previously, about the Starlink episode, and we'll delve with it a bit later. But it's actually quite sad that only one individual's decision can hold the attack, or even the defense in a case if Russia decides to attack the European soil.
Thanks, Mykola. Next up then, David, take us through some of the developments in robotic warfare and what can be done there.
First off, thank you for having me on. It's been a long-time listener, and it's an absolute pleasure to be able to come on and speak. But I just recently returned from the front line, where I spent a few weeks being embedded with drone and robotic units. And I attempted to add in insights from my experience on the front and what I saw with brigades working on these systems, and just thinking about the longer term ramifications of the technical pace of the war and how it's speeding up and what its implications can be from Europe. And I had the chance to see around 5-6 brigades or various units working on different parts of the front with these robotic systems. And the innovation cycle throughout the war and the initial 2 years typically lasted around anywhere from 3 to 6 months. And now often it can change in a matter of days or even hours. So from electronic warfare systems to even the growing kill zone on the front. And on certain parts of the front, we're certainly seeing, or the soldiers are feeling, that the Russians have even more drones than the Ukrainians do at this point. And there's certainly been no game changer in the war. There's no single weapon system, but rather it's a collection of systems. And Ukraine at this point in the war has certainly been exhausted. Manpower is a growing problem. And at that point, much like it's been throughout the war, technology has been what has allowed Ukraine to wage such a successful asymmetrical campaign against Russia. And now robots are doing more and more of the logistical work across the front line. So logistics and evacuations already account for almost 50% of the robotic missions on the front line. And this is followed up by Kazi-style attacks. So they load anti-tank mines on these ground robotics, drive them into trenches, hit logistical bridges. They've even started attaching rocket launchers to some of these ground drones, much like Ukraine did with sea drones, and knocking out 2 of the Russian fighter jets earlier this year. And some of these units that I visited on the front line have been adding all sorts of, whether it's flamethrowers, different types of rocket launchers, and then trying to deploy them and get immediate feedback and iterate on these robots and getting them to make really quick changes on the battlefield. So we think about procurement cycles for robotic systems or just any technology on the battlefield as well. I mean, if we're working with the time frame that lasts multiple years or even months at this point, I think Europe is really going to struggle if there's a war on Europe's eastern flank. And Europe certainly needs to look to Ukraine to leverage its experience in building a drone wall. And I think in this part of the war, the technology shield that Ukraine's going to be building with these robotic systems to supplement its drone wall and just the millions of drones that are out there on the battlefield.
Interesting. I was just in Wiesbaden, and whilst I was there, one of the subjects of the moment related to these smaller Ukrainian ventures, whether it be relating to drone technology, whether it be relating to robotics. I just wonder, what's your perspective on the financing question in relation to those kind of entities, and how does one rapidly scale their output for the war effort?
Yeah, I mean, well, first, it's what I saw on the front line in Ukraine is both absolute brilliance, but also painful to a certain degree. Is you see some of these soldiers that are building some of the most cutting edge robotics in warfare are often on social media conducting raffles or posting videos asking people for donations to be able to crowdsource money just to do some of the R&D that they need to do with the 2 or 3 person team in a garage near the front line. And I think Europe would benefit tremendously if money being the primary source for a lot of these units, or even Ukrainian companies working to try to scale up production of these robotic systems, money is most likely the leading issue that they have, along with some of like engineering problems that they need to solve around communication, and ensuring that there's minimal latency and that there's connection is not severed when they're trying to drive these robotic systems. So if money was to more vigorously flow to some of these Ukrainian companies or units, they'd be able to, I think, really rapidly scale up the production and deployment of even more ground robotic systems across the front lines. So I think Europe does need to pay more attention, and I think there is interest, but certainly more follow through needs to be had.
Thank you. So we've had the long-range strike capabilities, drone, robotic warfare. Let's turn to electronic warfare next. I know that's another subject that you've been looking into, David.
Yeah, and as for electronic warfare, I mean, being embedded with the drone recently, you see how challenging it truly is for these even drone units to be able to operate on the front with the really intense jamming that's going on. And Ukraine itself is trying to deploy a line of jammers across the front line, but the challenge is, from a technical perspective, is jammers don't always cover everything, like all signals. So often both sides can be frequency hopping and find ways to bypass the electronic warfare systems. And even myself, when I'm driving on the front line and through the kill zone, and after our driver dropped us off near the zero line, he was nearly ambushed by a drone. And especially given the wider proliferation of fiber optic drones that are unjammable, a lot of the soldiers that are driving in and out of the front are being ambushed by these fiber optic drones. But also, even if we step back and look at the broader picture and look at American systems such as HIMARS or ATACMS, the Russians have been successful at jamming even some of the most advanced technology or systems that we've been sending to Ukraine. And so it's also a lesson for Europe and the West in general that the Russians are really good at electronic warfare. And no matter how sophisticated the system is, there's still going to be challenges that are going to be faced by electronic warfare on the battlefield. And so it's important not only to be able to figure out ways of how to work around the electronic warfare issues that Europe is likely going to face, say in the Baltics, if it's shapes up to be a similar entrenched battle for Europe's eastern flank against Russia, and that there's, again, not going to be a single weapon or technology that allows for a breakthrough, but ensuring that you're using combined arms well and you have multiple systems in place and contingencies to work around. And for the Ukrainians and the Russians, has been relatively more simple solutions, such as attaching those wires to drones and ensuring that you're hitting high targets near the zero line, such as the opposing side's jammers. You use a fiber optic drone, you hit the jammer, then you can send in your radio controlled in drones to operate more freely to continue hitting heavy armor or infantry on the front line.
Interesting. Well, thank you, David. Let's turn to the last of our topics that you've covered in the report, and that is communications and satellite systems. Mykola, what can Europe do on that score if the US were out of the picture?
I think we need to look at it from the holistic perspective. So essentially, we need to look at the strike campaigns, and those strike campaigns, they usually pair missile systems with the satellite imagery and electronic warfare to locate, target, and neutralize the threats in the real time. And in this regard, obviously, we all know about Starlink. We know that it has around 6,000 satellites that are being used widely in the world. But unfortunately, we don't really have anything in comparison to that in European Union that can be scaled. At the moment, we have IRIS constellation, it plans around being 170 satellites by 2027. We obviously know about Starlink terminals that are being put in place. Unfortunately, we don't really have so many terminals in European Union that can be used. And what truly has to be done is we need to leverage public-private partnerships, of course, and we need to scale manufacturers like EU Telsat, OneWeb, And ideally, we would be looking at around 40,000 terminals in peacetime and not waiting until the first missile hits. Russians, as David pointed out, they've been really good at jamming some of those. So it becomes really difficult to even send the message. And one note is obviously to be cut by cyber attack, jamming, or political pressure. Everything starts working. And if you look at literally Kherson and Crimea, and what happened is that you can't rely just on the main comms link. You lose not just messages, but you lose targeting data, you lose situational awareness, and the ability to coordinate the strikes. And as David pointed out, the jamming has cut Ukrainian drone feeds mid-mission, forcing teams to fall back on slower, less accurate systems, and that, of course, costs life. And one thing that I wanted actually to mention is, of course, that Starlink is dependent, obviously, on one person who decides whether he has a good mood today or not. But to have some sort of a European system that is completely independent from the US ones, it's not just investment into Ukraine's capability, but having security for the future of European nation, and I think it has to be prioritized. And Europe can design networks that can survive both human and technical failure, but it has to layer them. So it has to be low Earth orbit for speed, it has to be geostationary for persistence, and optical laser links for jam resistance. And obviously, just to mention, hardened ground stations. And I think that's where we need to be. And to look at the projects like Europlus, to look at what I mentioned before, Eutelsat OneWeb, this is the key to success.
Well, thanks very much, Mykola, and thank you, David. We've really only scratched the surface there on some of the subjects that you cover in the report, which, as I say, is on this real pivotal issue of the moment. So that's the first subject covered, and we will have a link in the show notes to that fascinating piece. But Mykola, I can't let you go without talking about the other hat that you wear daily, which is, of course, the translation project for us. So for those who aren't familiar, I don't know which rock you've been living under if you aren't familiar, because we have an advert on it on the pod every day, but we do a Russian and Ukrainian translated version of the podcast. It takes our voices and then is translated automatically by AI. And then it's Mykola's job to listen through it, make sure that the AI has got all the information accurate, the grammar, everything else. And it is measurably challenging, as one can imagine, when dealing with cutting-edge technology. So we have interactions every day about the process. But first of all, Mykola, do you ever take a day off, or is Ukraine the latest, like with us, just part of your daily workout?
I'll be honest with you, I think it's basically my daily language gym session, so kind of like Duolingo or drugs. I've done the podcast from Pen Nevis, the Eiffel Tower, and somehow the connection there was actually better than in the middle of London. I even had to do the session from Westminster Palace at some point, just before the sanctions discussion with Bill Browder, and funneling the translation through my own phone was actually quite difficult. I think a Starlink on my desk wouldn't be the worst idea at this point.
And be honest, have you ever started hearing Dom Nichols' voice in your head when you're off duty?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, sometimes halfway through my grocery list, I hear Dom or Francis in my head saying, and now I turn to Joe Burns for grocery updates. What's it going to be in today? Putanesca, or rather Putinesca or carbonara? It's like living with a permanent internal broadcast.
Well, a fate worse than death, I'm sure. When you're using the technology that we use, Ola, to turn Ukrainian and Russian into this polished English audio, how do you keep it sounding right? I mean, do you still have time to fix all of the titles, the names of places? I mean, talk us through the process.
Yeah, so ideally what you're going to have, you're obviously going to have a voice or a road, having Francis' voice or Dom or Adelie or someone else, and essentially the AI will translate the initial part. Then you need to do some automation, and that's why I do some automation workflow. So I basically look at the text that has been ready, so I can basically try to find the names that are not correct. I can match the tone, and that's actually quite difficult difficult because it requires us to record full sessions with Francis or Dom, try to copy the voice, and then we need to sync the pace of speech, which is actually the hardest. I think Eleven Labs, they're doing everything what they can, but I think that's what being actually the most difficult part, because I have to sit down and essentially I'm listening, editing, and then whenever something pops up, I have to go back, quickly edit it, and continue the road moving forward. So yeah, it's been troubling sometimes, but honestly, it's just been such a pleasure working with you guys, and everything what you do, and bringing those segments from anywhere in the world, it's remarkable.
Oh, well, thanks, Mykola. And I know that listeners enjoy hearing behind the scenes. The interview we did with Giles Gear, our producer for the first 2 years of the war, was a real favourite for many of you. So thank you for what you do. Adelie, I know you've got some questions here.
Yes, Mykola, how obviously the AI translates our voice in Ukrainian and Russian, but we can't tell how we sound in these languages because to us it just sounds foreign. How do we sound to a native from these two languages? Do we sound weird?
So, funnily enough, I think Francis, and I don't know, proud to say that maybe you were Ukrainian in your previous life, but actually...
Francis wins this.
Brilliant.
But he definitely wins it, I would say. Adelie actually sounds like a Ukrainian Canadian. And because I actually have Ukrainian friends who grew up in Canada or the US, obviously they have a bit of an accent. And I think we had an instant, Adelie, and please mention it, when we tried to actually use a bit of a French translation. Tell about that.
Oh, yes. When we were playing around with the software before launch, I wanted to experiment with it. And so what I did is I put a recording of my voice in English into the software and asked it to translate me in French to see if my AI French voice sounded like myself. Well, turns out it did not sound like myself at all, but also it gave me a Quebecois accent, which I don't know what 11 Lab has got with either my voice or its software. Maybe I don't even know if they're Canadian, but no, it did not sound like me, and I do not have a Quebecois accent in French.
I think I just have to blame your voice, Adelie. I don't think we can blame the tech on this one.
Yes, okay. I may just leave the studio then, Francis.
Well, thank you very much, Mykola, for talking us through that. And I should say that if you weren't aware that we did these translations, we'll add, as we always do, a link in the show notes to it. And please do spread the word for those who, for whatever reason, can't access our reporting in English and would like and find it helpful to have a resource of the key updates every day in Ukrainian or in Russian. And the reason that we've got it in Russian, of course, is that there are so many parts of Eastern Europe where that is the second spoken language. And so it's to give people access to that information, as well as in Ukraine as well. But let's turn now to our final thoughts. I'll come to Mykola and David in a moment. But Adélie, where would you like to leave listeners today?
My final thought is just adding a little bit about this children's story in this catalogue. I think it's really interesting that although the children in the catalogue, quote unquote, are Ukrainian kids on Ukrainian soil, for Russia, they would probably be technically considered, in their mind, in their perspective, Russian kids or Russian-to-be kids on Russian soils, although I've been told by sources that they are not quite considering the DPR and the LPR quite in the similar way from like a legislative jurisdiction point of view, the same way they are other areas in Russia, so it would still be quite different. But this is not a list, this catalogue is not something you can really show Putin and say, bring those children back from Russia. One, because the children might still be in Donetsk and Luhansk, and also because they're technically Ukrainian kids on Ukrainian soil, technically speaking, if it were not for the war. So it's an interesting way of like to understand how Russia is also bringing these data sets, these organizations, the ministry, all the institution within the sort of Russian embrace and Russian system. And I think that's just worth flagging in terms of how these things are happening on a very sort of like mechanical level of institution.
Well, thank you, Adelie, for that. David, where would you like to leave listeners today?
I would say, regardless of what happens with this upcoming summit with Trump and Putin, I think many of Ukraine's frontline leaders, certainly there's no way to replace infantry on the front, but Ukraine is trying to prepare itself for a very long fight with technology and trying to have robotic systems replace humans wherever they can across the front line, and trying to build more autonomous capabilities to have these drones and robots be able to operate autonomously and hit targets as needed. And in an ideal state, Ukraine hopes to have more of these robots managing some of those lines, logistical lines, serving as air defense systems against enemy FPV drones. And I think if that vision can be executed well, Ukraine will be able to leverage technology to stay in the fight for many more years. And I think is going to be a reason why Zelensky and some of his military planners will be confident that Ukraine can stay in the fight and continue to fight on if a very unjust deal is being forced upon Ukraine. But of course, it remains dependent on many factors. But I'm confident that the Ukrainians know what they're doing. They're very innovative. They have bright minds. And I think Europe needs to make sure that we're studying all these lessons from the technological war that's going on between Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you very much, David. Mykola, you've got the final words for today.
Obviously, I completely agree with David. I think Ukraine is still preparing for the worst case scenario, as it always been, and it will do everything to protect itself and actually not give up on any territory. And I actually wanted to mention one company that is very close to my heart. Its name is TREMBITA, TREMBITA. It's actually named after the longest musical instrument in the world that is in Ukraine. The TREMBITA actually is a metal detector and is a standout innovation. It's lightweight, durable, and designed for the harsh conditions that these Ukrainian sappers face daily. It combines the high sensitivity, and the company behind TREMBITA is now developing robotic solutions to make clearance even faster and safer, and is actually seeking partners to scale this technology in Western countries. If you want to get involved or assist, please let us know. Your support could save lives. And the need is urgent. Just for your understanding, more than 137,000 square kilometers of Ukraine's land, including 14,000 square kilometers of inland waters, are contaminated with mines and exploded ordnance. Since the full-scale invasion, there have been 884 incidents, injuring 1,260 civilians and killing 350, without mentioning any drone strikes with loitering munitions and mines. Even if a political deal were struck tomorrow, Ukraine would still face one of the largest demining operations in modern history, and innovations like TREMBITA will be essential to completing it. Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.